It's an honor to have Charlie Outwaite here with us. She's joining from London, and she is a research fellow based at the Zoological Society of London. Her research takes a macroecological approach to understanding insect decline, using large databases to explore patterns of change over time and in space. She's currently a part of GLITRS, Glitters project, which is focused on understanding how insects respond to drivers of change at the global scale through bringing together different forms of evidence, including expert opinions, meta-analysis, and space for time analysis. And although her research is computational and doesn't involve fieldwork, she enjoys putting out moth traps to explore the wonders of nocturnal insect life. Today, she's talking on understanding global changes in insect biodiversity, current knowledge gaps, and opportunities for the future. Here, Charlie.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I hope you're having a wonderful time over there learning more about insects. And hopefully I'll be able to share a bit more about my work and taking a bit of a global look at insect biodiversity change. Let's crack on then. So just to let you know, this talk is very much going to be taking a macroecological focus to thinking about insect biodiversity change. So we're thinking about big spatial scales, big timeframes, and what we would call big data. So don't ask me any questions about any individual insects because I'm not going to have a clue. My work is very much focused on large-scale patterns. And I'd like you to have a little think about some points as we go through this talk. And I've kind of highlighted some key areas that you might want to think about in the kind of orange boxes as we go through. But it would just be good to keep in the back of your mind while we're talking about large-scale biodiversity change, what is being monitored, how is it being monitored, where is it being monitored, and is the data that we're using good enough to understand large-scale change in insect biodiversity? So keep thinking about those things as we go through. So as I'm sure you already know, insects are a massive group of organisms, and they comprise up to 90% of all multicellular animal species, which is just incredible. I think what is more amazing is that most of these are still undescribed. So there are loads of species out there that we haven't even discovered yet, we haven't named, and we barely understand. And compared to more charismatic, perhaps, groups such as birds or mammals, they're relatively understudied. So there's lots of incredible science out there still to be done. But of course, insects, they're not just the pretty face. And you may disagree with me, but I think moths in particular have very pretty faces. People often laugh at me at that though. So they also provide a range of essential ecosystem services. So not only are they kind of food for other animals like birds, bats, also mammals, but they also provide a lot of great services such as pollination, pest control, decomposition that support and underpin terrestrial and freshwater systems. And I think it's often easy to forget just how important insects are when our day-to-day lives and perhaps day-to-day experiences of insects are often of them as pests, or perhaps of some of the disservices that they provide, perhaps through eating crops or causing disease. But I love insects just because of their sheer variety and awesomeness. And I'm sure you've got some amazing examples of your favourite insects as well. And I would love to hear those at some point if you want to drop me an email. But I've picked out some of the amazing things that I think is really cool to share about insects. So one of my favourite species of moth is the death's head hawk moth. I was very much a data person until quite recently and didn't really kind of go near insects, if we're being honest. And then we set out a moth trap on a field course one day and we caught a death's head hawk moth. And I didn't realise that we had species this big in the UK. It's quite unusual over here to have such big things. And I found out that this species often likes to eat honey from beehives, and it can squeak like a mouse when it's scared. And I just thought that was incredible. But there are loads of other awesome things out there. So carrion beetles are also another great example of some strange weirdness. These beetles capture and bury corpses under the ground to then feed their young. And what's actually quite rare for this species is that they actually provide parental care to their young. So they look after their young, which is very rare in insects as well. There's actually a moth species that lives in the fur of the three-toed sloth, which when I found out, I was just like, what, are you kidding me? So the kind of female moths will wait for the sloths to descend and then lay eggs in the dung that is left on the floor, and then the adults reproduce and grow within the fur of the three-toed sloth. And then finally, an example of something I just think is incredible are the parasitoid wasps. So there are hundreds and hundreds, thousands of species of parasitoid wasps that kind of lay their eggs, and the young will feed on the living body of something else, which I think is just truly gross, but also awesome as well. And there can be parasitoids of parasitoids of parasitoids. So hopefully just some little examples there of some of the amazingness that is in the insect world. And I think it's really important to share these things, because people who don't work with this kind of group are often just a bit underwhelmed by insects and just think of all the kind of things ruining my picnic, or oh, there's bugs everywhere, I don't like it. So we've got to share these amazing stories to help encourage others to love insects as we do. But of course, insect biodiversity change has been studied for many years now, but it's only been quite recently that we've really been thinking about this kind of change at the global scale. And this came about because a number of studies were published in around 2017, 2018 that really caught the media's attention. And we saw headline titles such as the ones shown here. So insect apocalypse is here, ecological Armageddon is arriving. And these kind of headlines really threw attention to the insects that they just haven't really seen before in the media. And the papers that drove these headlines are shown on the right here. And we're going to go through each of those and have a little bit of a think about what it is that they were showing and why they got so much attention. So the first paper was by Hallman et al. And this paper looked at the change in insect biomass, in particular for flying insects, in a number of protected areas across Germany. And this one really caught the headlines because of this kind of huge title saying there was a 75% decline over 27 years in flying insect biomass in protected areas. And of course, this is very shocking, a very large number, something we should really be worried about. But let's take a little bit of a closer look at what this paper was showing. So it was only looking at flying insects. It was looking at biomass, which can be quite a tricky metric to kind of understand change in for biodiversity. It was looking only in protected areas, and it looked at a few sites across Germany, and not many of them were resampled every year. But of course, a big number and a very concerning decline. But hopefully keep an eye on those orange boxes and you might see some patterns coming out here. So next up was this paper by Lister and Garcia. So they set a number of traps to resample areas that were sampled in the 1970s, so 1976 and 77, and they compared these kind of roughly two time periods to look at how the biomass of a number of arthropods has changed between those two time periods. But importantly, this was just one forest in Puerto Rico and just two time points. So it's quite surprising that this paper received such kind of massive media attention, considering perhaps slightly limited sampling that has occurred here. But it is still quite concerning, the real drastic change in that biomass that we see in the figure between those two time periods. So hopefully you can see my pointer between this kind of early 70s kind of time period and then this later 2011 to 13 period. Sanchez Bio and Ukies. And this one was more of a review, so it was drawing on papers published within the literature, and they were searching specifically for papers that have shown insect declines and that have carried out surveys and shown declines within an area to look at estimated rates of decline and to summarise those to try and get a sense of what the overall decline on average might be at the global scale. So you can see they saw quite a lot of variation across the different orders that they were able to look at, and with perhaps a bit more variety kind of happening for the Coleoptera and the Lepidoptera compared to the Hymenoptera. But if we look at the map of where these studies came from, we can see a real bias in the sources of the data. So, as is often the case, we have a lot of data from Europe, and we have quite a lot of data from North America, and just a few sample points from other regions of the world. So at the time when these kind of papers came out, it was a little bit concerning, because these papers are obviously getting a lot of attention, which on the one hand I think is great, because insect declines and insects in general have very little kind of hold on the media. They don't often make it into the news because they're less charismatic than perhaps birds or mammals. And so on the one hand, it's great. Insects are finally getting the attention that they deserve. But also there were these very large headlines that were kind of insinuating that this insect apocalypse is here, there's massive changes all over the world. But actually there were a lot of gaps in the data that's being used. And there was some concern that this might lead to perhaps some mistrust in science if we start over kind of exaggerating our results and trying to suggest things are happening where perhaps they're not. But of course, we also need to consider the fact that a number of studies are showing insect declines, particularly in certain regions of the world. So it really is something that we need to be concerned about. And so I'm going to share a few more recent studies now where there's been a bit of an attempt to try to fill some of these gaps, or at least to try to take a little bit of a bigger picture view of how insect biodiversity is changing. So this paper here is one that made up part of my PhD. So here we were looking just at the UK, but we were trying to use citizen science data to increase the taxonomic coverage of what we were able to look at in terms of trends over time. So in the UK, we're very fortunate in that we have a lot of people that are interested in biodiversity in general. And as a result of that, we have a lot of volunteer-led recording schemes. So people will go out in their free time and collect records of different species and submit them to these recording schemes. And then we're able to use the data to look at trends over time. Now, on the one hand, this is great because we get lots of data from lots of weird and wonderful groups. Of course, the people are recording the usual things like butterflies and bees, but they're also recording some of the weirder things. So fungus gnats and weird kinds of beetles and slime molds and lots of random things. So without these volunteers, we would have very little data. So it's great that we have these people that are really interested in this. But of course, this data can be quite messy. So it's just observations of species. There's no kind of standardized sampling method. So we have to use some kind of quite complicated modeling techniques to be able to assess this data. But what we were able to show is that by analysing this data, and we ran models for over, I think it was 5,000 species in the end, we were able to see that actually there's a lot of variation in what is happening to things over time. So here we've got some aggregated indicators of the different species trends, separated out into different groups. So we can see that, for example, the bryophytes and lichens, not insects, but also important, and we can see that there's a bit of an increase in their occupancy over time from this data set. For insects in general, we've got a slight increase and then a more recent decline. For other invertebrate groups, this includes mollusks and centipedes and millipedes, things like that. It looks quite stable, this trend, just below the kind of starting level. But then what was quite interesting was that we found this kind of unusual U-shaped trend for the freshwater group. And this includes things like dragonflies, stoneflies, mayflies, a lot of things that live in an aquatic system. And this kind of U-shaped trend hadn't really been seen before, but it kind of suggests that there were some very strong declines, and then something happened in around the 90s that led to a recovery of those populations, which then looks to have stabilised in more recent years. So this is quite exciting, and we've been able to expand the taxonomic coverage of our knowledge for the UK at least, but there are still some gaps, still some kind of issues with what we're able to show. So we're only looking at species occupancy, that's whether something is present or not within a site. So we're not looking at abundance here or species richness, which are perhaps a little bit more specific metrics. It is very messy data. And of course, this is just the UK, which is a very tiny space in the grand scheme of things. Another paper that's tried to really broaden our understanding of insect change is this one by Roel van Klink and colleagues. So they took a kind of meta-analytical approach where they've looked through the literature to try and compile as many data sets as they can that's looking at insect biodiversity change. And they were able to compile quite a lot of data for both freshwater and terrestrial groups. So you can see from the map here again where they were able to get this data from. The usual gaps in coverage, unfortunately, but they were able to look at a lot of metrics. So they've got abundance, biomass, and kind of combinations of these, lots of different regions they were able to separate out, and a number of different kind of biomes as well. And the main kind of take home here was that actually there are very different patterns again in what we see in the terrestrial and the freshwater realm. So in this top figure in particular, you can see that the brown points are the terrestrial ones, and that they are generally on the declining or the kind of, negative end of the trend slope of the figure, whereas the freshwater points are generally on the positive side. So very different things happening in different kind of realms here. So very interesting paper. But again, unfortunately, all those gaps that we usually see in our large data sets are still there. And then most recently, there's been this great paper looking more in particular at freshwater insect biodiversity, and showing very similar things to what we showed in our UK paper, is that there have been some more gradual increases, but more recently, those recoveries have kind of plateaued. So if we just go back to the UK one, we can see that plateau here. We've got the recovery, and then more recently, things have stabilised. And this paper also found a similar kind of pattern across the European scale. So both richness and abundance seem to be on average doing pretty well, but more recently, if we look at changes over time, they've kind of stayed quite stable more recently. So whatever was driving that recovery has perhaps stopped, or perhaps there are other negative pressures on freshwater biodiversity that are keeping those levels from recovering further. But again, this is just Europe, and it's quite a short baseline starting at just 1995. So at the global scale, or at large scales, are insects declining on average or not? Some studies have shown declines, some studies have shown stabilization, some have shown increases even. So what is going on? It's very, very complicated. And I think the fact that we're still so unsure about what is happening at this global scale for insects is because there are still a number of biases that are present within our data sets. So hopefully you've been looking at those orange boxes and you've been able to pick up on some of the things I've been hinting at, is that we've got a lot of geographical bias. So a lot of studies do come from North America or Europe when they are aggregated together. We have quite a lot of taxonomic bias. So perhaps not so obvious here, but we can't look at everything. So often studies will focus on one thing, and we tend to have more data for the more charismatic taxonomic groups. So people love a butterfly, so we have quite a lot of information on butterflies usually. People also love bees, so they're probably the second most monitored group. But what about everything else? There are so many other groups out there that we don't really know what's going on, and some that haven't even been named, of course. And we also have issues with temporal bias. So we have very few long-term data sets. In some places, we're quite lucky. We might have some standardized data going back to perhaps 1970, but that's not really that far back, especially if we think about all the changes that have happened in the world, industrialization, the expansion of agriculture. A lot of that happened before that time. So we really don't have a good baseline to start with in the first place to see if things are getting back to a good kind of level. So I think there's still a lot of things that we need to do to try to address these biases so that we can get a better picture of what's happening to insects at the global scale. And I think here are some ideas. It's obviously very tricky and it's going to involve a lot of collaboration, but we need to try to collate data or collect data from these undersampled regions. And I'm sure in many cases there are data available. It just hasn't made it into these data sets because whatever reason, it hasn't been shared very widely, or It's not openly available, for example. To address the taxonomic biases, we need to support identification and naming of species that are new to science. We also need to try and focus more on those understudied taxa. So as much as we love the butterflies and bees, we've got to think about all the other stuff as well. So what about the ants? What about the beetles? What about all the strange flies? There's a lot of things we can look at as well as bees, bees and butterflies. And the temporal biases one is a little bit more tricky because, of course, we can't go back in time to try to figure out what was going on in the past. So we need to try to compile data that's already available, but also set up and support new long-term monitoring programs so that we can start to get a handle on trends going forward. And ideally, what we would like to see in those trends is, of course, a recovery or an increase. But it is tricky to compare that when we don't have information from the past. So let's move on then from the what is happening to think a little bit more about why is it happening. So what are the drivers of the declines that we do see, and the things that we could be potentially trying to change to reverse these declines? So of course, a lot of studies have been done at the local scale to try to understand what kind of things impact insect biodiversity. And we know that things like climate change, the use of insecticides, pollution, the increasing urbanization of land are all issues that affect insect biodiversity. And a number of studies have tried to start to quantify these things at the global scale. So thinking about, if we think about the whole planet, what are the most important threats to insects? Because if we know that, we can start being a little bit more targeted with our conservation, with our policies to try to make the biggest difference. So this study by Milichek et al. Ran a survey across a number of different experts to get their opinions essentially on what were the biggest drivers of insect change. And they found the top three was agriculture, climate change, and pollution. And these things, I guess they're not really a surprise, but there's going to be a lot of variation. And they did see that when they were looking at different regions of the world, that in some places it's considered that agriculture is more important, and in other places it might be pollution. But it's really important to try to understand these things. And of course, they had a number of biases themselves in terms of the number of experts working on different insect groups. And that's what that figure in the bottom right-hand corner shows, is that most people were working on Lepidoptera and Coleoptera, so our butterflies, moths, and the beetles. So as usual, we have biases, but we're trying to get a better handle on what's driving change. And this is a study that myself and colleagues undertook a few years ago to, again, try to get at this, what is driving change at the global scale. And this time we're trying to think about the interactions between drivers, because of course, pressures in the environment don't often work alone. They often interact with each other, and these interactions can lead to a greater impact than if they worked in isolation. So here we were looking at the interaction between agricultural land use and climate change. So if we just look first at the agricultural land use part in this left-hand figure, we can see that the higher the intensity of the land use, the greater reductions in insect abundance we see, and also in species richness. And these are some quite large declines. And we get these results by compiling information from a number of studies into one big database and then running a kind of space for time analysis to try to understand what's happening. And you can see all the data points on the map here. So again, there are a lot of gaps and the usual kind of biases in where we get data from, but it's decent coverage and a little bit better than some other studies. And when we add in the climate change part, so this bottom right-hand figure, we have a measure of climate change on the x-axis. So the further to the right you get, the warmer it has been compared to the past. And we can look at the change in insect abundance in the places that we have all this data for. We can see that when you combine climate change and high intensity agriculture, we see the greatest decline. So we see this kind of interactive effect of these two drivers on insect biodiversity change. Of course, you end up working in these kind of regions of research that can be very depressing, but we did find some positives in this work as well. We found that if you have more natural habitat surrounding your agricultural sites, that this can help to lessen those declines in insect biodiversity. But importantly, that was only the case in low intensity agriculture. So some important messages were able to come out of that kind of very large scale study. And then finally, another example of how we can try to get at understanding the pressures on insects is by running meta-analyses. So hopefully you know that meta-analysis is bringing together lots of different studies that have assessed similar things in different locations, and then you bring this into one model to try to get an idea of the average response. So this one, for example, was looking at the impact on insects and arachnids of nutrient enrichment. So they were looking at nitrogen and other kinds of fertilizer and how that impacted diversity. And they looked at over 900 studies, which is pretty impressive. And I do feel sorry for the amount of papers that they had to read and extract data from. But again, we have kind of coverage issues where a large proportion of this information was from North America. So what is driving declines at these large scales? So I think it's quite clear now that we know what the main culprits are. We know climate change, we know pesticide use and other things are really bad, but we haven't necessarily quantified those impacts. So we can often do very correlational studies, or there are a number of biases holding back our understanding. So there's a lot more to be done here to try and understand the impacts of these things on insects at large scales. So thinking ahead, what can we do better to fill the gaps, to understand these things at the large scale? So we've had a little bit of a talk about filling data gaps. So we really need to try to collate data from those understudied regions. We need to address this taxonomic bias where we're often just looking at certain groups more than others. Quantifying the impact of drivers of change, I think, is really important because it helps us to prioritize what to reduce and how to try to bend that curve of insect declines to lead to the recoveries more than the declines. But we also need to scale up current monitoring. There are very few regions of the world that have good coverage in monitoring. And if we're able to expand that, then it's only going to be for the better. More data is always good, right? So let's have a think about where the data actually comes from. So a number of the studies that I've shown you today have used large databases of information. So the paper by Van Klink used the insect change database. So this is looking at time series of insects in the freshwater and terrestrial realm, and arachnids as well. And this has all been compiled into one data set. But of course, bringing all these studies together is a lot of work, so there are still gaps. Similarly, the study I showed you from my own work, with all those points from all over the world looking at climate change and land use interactions, that data is from the PREDICTS database. So PREDICTS is a database that covers not just insects, but lots of biodiversity. And it collates studies from all over the world for those that have assessed different land uses or different land use intensities. And so we can pull all that information together to try and look at these large-scale studies. And then finally, as part of the Glitters project, which I'm working on now, we're trying to build another time series database to, again, try to fill gaps, try to bring data together into one place so it's easier to assess large-scale changes over time. So there are a number of existing databases. There are things that we can use. So long-term monitoring schemes often have data that is available, and we can make compilations of existing data as these data sets have done here. But importantly, it relies on data being open and being shared so that it can be put into these data sets. And often it's just very few people actually organizing the data and very small teams that are trying to pull this stuff together. So any help or making of things easier or easier to import or easier to share is always a really good idea. So what can we do to try to help fill some of these gaps? So of course, we've said already that starting new monitoring schemes is going to be able to help fill data gaps in different locations and perhaps also different taxonomic groups. It's really important to be open with our data. I know it's very tempting to kind of keep it to ourselves, but we want to be able to understand what's happening at large scales, and we want to be able to do that without worrying about lots of data gaps. So if possible, being open with data so it can be incorporated into these larger data sets, I think is quite important. And make an effort to share. If you know you've got a data set that will fit into one of these data sets, get in touch with someone, because they'll probably really appreciate sharing of data and being made aware of different data sets. Because like I've said, it's often very small teams running or organising these data sets. And it can be very challenging for people to, get in touch with everyone, trawl through the data sets available online. So if you can get in touch with someone and say, my data is going to work for you, then they're going to love that. Oh, and I should say that often these data sets are open and available for use as well. So if you have an interesting question that is trying to look at change at large scales, then you can find these data sets and use them yourselves in your research too. There have been a lot of calls recently in the literature about how we need to move forward to better understand insect declines. I've shared a couple of the papers on the side here if you're interested, but what a lot of them are saying is that we need more data. There's a call for people to start up these long-term monitoring initiatives, saying we need to fill space in understudied habitats, also sample a broader range of taxa, incorporate experiments. There are lots of different things trying to say we need more data, we need more data. But what we've been thinking about in the Glitters project is how we can make the most of data that we have already. What data do we have right now that can help us to understand insect change? So we've been working on a paper that is talking about ways to combine different types of evidence, because we think by combining different evidence types, we can take advantage of the fact that they have different strengths in different places to better understand what's going on. So if you've got a gap in one kind of data set, maybe it can be filled by information from another. And the examples that we use here are thinking about combining time series data, experimental data, spatial comparisons like the land use climate interaction one that I showed you, and expert elicitation, so asking experts their opinion, to try to understand bigger questions of insect change. And the figure shown here just kind of tries to highlight how each of these different data sets has different strengths and weaknesses. So some have better temporal coverage, some might have better spatial coverage, some might have better taxonomic coverage, but they all kind of differ. And hopefully when we bring them together, it gives us a better strength to understand what's happening. So I was hoping this paper would be out by now, but not quite. We're nearly there. But yeah, keep an eye out. And if you keep an eye out for it, or if you're interested, drop me an email and I can send it over to you. Ooh, wrong way. So how can we scale up current monitoring efforts? So this is something that I'm newly getting involved with in different projects, but new technologies are offering a whole range of opportunities for filling some of these data gaps, making some things easier for monitoring. So things like environmental DNA, which is just incredible. You can go out, take a water sample, soil sample, air sample. You can sequence that information and get a kind of species list of what is potentially in the environment, which I think is just mad. It feels very sci-fi to me. We also have automated insect monitoring through camera traps and acoustic traps that are also being developed, which is also really exciting. And something I've been thinking a little bit more about is these camera traps and how they can be used to support monitoring schemes to help fill some of these gaps. So at the moment, a lot of insect data is collected in a whole range of methods. So we can walk transects to count butterflies, we can catch flying insects in a malaise trap, we can get ground beetles and other ground dwelling things using a pitfall trap. There are lots of different methods, right? And they are more or less easy to collect, but they all take up a lot of time. Some of these methods are destructive, so they involve killing insects as well, like the pan traps and sometimes malaise traps. So there are a lot of potential issues with the way we collect data right now, but most importantly, it's quite intensive. It takes a lot of people power and it can take a lot of money to pay the people to go and collect this data. So camera traps for insects can actually bring a bit of an alternative. And this is something we've been thinking about in a cost action project called Insect AI, which is bringing together researchers from lots of different countries to talk about how we can encourage people to use these camera traps. We can develop them for this kind of use and make things a little bit more standardized. So there are a couple of examples of traps I've shown here. So this is the sticky pie trap. The camera is in the yellow part. It has a sticky, like a sticky trap like you would normally put outside on the white part with a light shining on it. So it attracts insects, they stick to the board, and then it can capture images of those to see what's there. And then you can use AI to identify the species, which is shown in this bottom figure. On this side, we have the Amy trap, which is an automated monitoring of insects light trap. So it has a light on the top. And similar again, we've got a board and a camera. And this one is more generally designed for moths. So the moths land on the whiteboard. It takes images with movement or every few seconds. And then you can take that data, the image data, and again, use AI methods to identify the species in there. And these kind of techniques have a range of benefits. So you can leave them outside for long periods. You can collect data through the day, through the night. It can speed up the identification process if you can get AI to do most of the work rather than individual people. Some methods are destructive. So this sticky pie trap does stick insects. So you can keep the samples and kind of do genetics on them later. But others, like the Amy trap, are non-destructive. So it can also be helpful in that sense. But there are still a number of challenges with kind of costs and identification. If a human can't identify species without dissecting it, then AI isn't going to be able to do it just from a photo either. So some benefits and some limitations, but I think it's an exciting area of research at the moment. But there are a number of challenges, and these are the things we're trying to address in this cost action project. So how do we get people to use these new technologies? It might be that there are issues with cost, or perhaps they just want to stick to their original method. They have some kind of, prejudice against using these new technologies. How do we integrate the data that we get from these new technologies with data that already exists? So we know that there can be issues with sampling biases that can lead to, some dodgy signals in our data. So what do we do when we have two different sampling methods and we want to bring them together? There's some statistical challenges there. And of course, like I said, we're still not going to be able to ID everything. So what do we do for the more tricky things, the things that have to be dissected, or perhaps the very small things that we just can't get good enough images for? So still a number of questions for this going forward. But essentially, I've just got a few messages to kind of wrap up this talk. I think, of course, insects are great. I'm sure you do too. But I think it's important that we share this excitement, this love of insects, because people can often forget how important they are or how cool they are. They just see the kind of everyday things that bug them and they forget about the awesome and the exciting. So let's remind them. There are still a lot of uncertainties in what we know for insect change at large scales. And this is often due to data availability and biases. And we always need more data. So let's try to work together to fill gaps, to collate information so that we can better understand these things and hopefully promote recovery rather than decline. And I think a lot of new methods do bring opportunities that can complement existing data sets, but they are in the very early stages at the moment. So there's still a lot of work there to be done. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, then perhaps look into the cost action project, look into the people involved and see if you can get in touch with them as well. Awesome, thank you very much. I hope it's been a little bit interesting at least. There are a number of ways that you can get in touch with me if you do have any kind of follow-ups or you want to look into the projects that I'm involved with at the moment. The website suggests there. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you've been having a great day so far.